And now let's discuss this and a lot more with Shruti Kapila, who's a professor of history and politics at the University of Cambridge and also co-director of the Global Humanities Initiative. Well, Shruti Kapila, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an interesting period, right? I'm sure you've been sitting and reading all those memes that have been created all week long. Somebody of Indian origin and somebody of Pakistani origin may potentially be sitting and arguing about the partition of the UK.
Well, of course, I mean, it's actually an Amar Akbar Anthony moment is my favorite meme, because you have a Hindu and you have a Muslim, and also in Ireland, you have a Christian from Goa. And really the fate of the union is really in South Asia's great secular tradition. And you could say the empire has truly struck back. And I think it's fascinating to see, I mean, not to make too political a point, it's fascinating to see the multicultural arrival at the top table in British politics. And you also have Sadiq Khan, the Labour mayor of London. So you have, as it were, the top, as it were, positions of political office in a very natural way, almost, it seems. Of course, it's been a struggle, I'm sure, for these communities to get to the top table. But it feels like a real moment of maturity, despite the fact that there are a large number of crises going on in British politics. It feels like a moment of celebration and even, I would say, maturity. And it's also a bit sad, because I grew up in India, to see that actually it's the opposite. We seem to be less multicultural, less diverse in our political offices in India, whereas Britain now seems to have gone the other way.
Just taking that point up about Rishi Sunak becoming the Prime Minister was interesting by itself. But for Humza to become, the first Minister of Scotland is actually quite dramatic, because Scotland is not as diverse a nation as, let's say, England is. It's what, 96% white, Scotland? So for them to pick somebody of Pakistani origin as the first minister is quite interesting. How did it happen?
It is. It is. I mean, I do think, of course, the Muslim South Asian population in Scotland has been pretty, as it were, politically active for about more than 20, 30 years. You also had ministers in Tony Blair's government for the first time. You actually got to see them publicly, as it were, coming of age, Muslims, Scottish MPs. But I think it's a different history of race from America. I think in America, I mean, I've lived and worked in America, where I think it's a much more institutionalized, not just, I mean, I'm not saying there is no racism in this country, but I think the fact is that the history of slavery is very different and in America versus here, which here the whole polity is much more post-imperial. It comes from, as it were, the British Empire decolonizing. And of course, Humza is from East Africa. So he comes from a double migration out of South Asia, where you had South Asian Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus going to do the work of empire in the early 20th century. And in fact, it's the 50th year of the expulsion of South Asians from Africa. And so it's a kind of timely moment to also see that. Even Sunak's family has some of that genealogy. So it's to do with how post-empire Britain has shaped up. I mean, of course, you had the terrible times of Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood speech that he had made in the 70s, which was a high watermark of segregation, even you could say, and separation in British politics. But I think here my bias might come out, because I came to Britain to study in the late 90s, and it was really a moment of great opening in British culture.
But hang on just a minute. All of that is very well to say, but hey, we're just a few years after Brexit. And what is Brexit all about? Let's make Britain, white, let's keep the immigrants out. That certainly seemed to be the logic of Brexit, wasn't it? And now, here you have a situation where all these years after Brexit, suddenly all the people who are leading the UK or leading Ireland or leading Scotland are people of color, people of South Asian origin. So isn't it that there's a certain irony in that as well?
Well, Brexit has been about Europe and it's still not resolved. And I think whether it is Sunak or Humza, they will be working that through. I mean, in fact, the question of the union is a serious one at this point, given that the SNP is, Humza's party has been demanding another referendum for the separation of Scotland from as it were, the union. But I think just to say that actually Brexit has been more about European issues rather than South Asian or more global ones. After all, the drive against immigration and even asylum, sometimes some of the most brutal policies of late are being prosecuted by a second generation Indian, i.e. Suella Braverman, the current Home Secretary. So I think it doesn't mean that just because you are non-white, you're necessarily going to be progressive. But Humza's election is a big achievement, especially as you say, it is a minority in every respect. It's a minority who has come to power. And I think that's what I yearn for India. When is it that India will have a real minority popular leader in its midst ruling it? And not simply, I mean, Dr. Manmohan Singh was there, but winning popular office, winning popular office. And I think that will, since we talk so much about India's, great multicultural democracy, it's time India showed a little bit more diversity in its political power.
All right, Shruti Kapila, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective. Thank you so much for being with us.